What we see here are our material nodes, or at least those I could reasonably fit in the panel. We don't have specific videos concentrating on single materials, mainly because there's already loads of tutorials out there, both on YouTube and the NewTek site, that cover the individual material nodes and do a pretty good job of it. So I feel there's little point in repeating all of that stuff. However, what I do want to do, because these things aren't often mentioned, is take a more general look at the materials as a whole, just to make sure you've got all of the little details that are relevant to materials usage that aren't always mentioned. First of all, what our materials are, they're basically shaders, somewhat like the shader nodes, except they're composed of multiple shaders, so they have shaders for diffuse and reflection, and specular and anything else in them. So they're complex shaders, and what they do are model for different types of material. For instance, conductor and dielectric. One easy way to divide up materials that we see in the real world is into conductors and dielectric materials. Conductors are, funnily enough, things that are conductive, pretty much metals. Dielectrics are non-conductive materials, glass, water, plastic, although our dielectric node itself is designed for transparent materials, rather than all dielectrics. We have some materials that are special purpose, like the shadow catcher node, which, as its name suggests, is for catching shadows of things, for using compositing and the like, and we can see of course that it also has reflection with reflection blurring to allow you to catch reflections onto surfaces. Right, one thing to take note of about materials, very important and common between them, is the specular value. You'll notice that all of these nodes have a specularity port on them, yet none seem to have a reflections port, even though of course some of them, like conductor, skin and so forth, clearly boast reflections, and of course reflection blurring as well. Specular is just another name for reflection. Normally reflected light is called the specular. In CG we talk about them separately because specular is a cheap way of faking a reflection that renders much faster, whereas a reflection is of course a ray-traced reflection. These material nodes contain models for both specularity and ray-traced reflection, so they only have a specular input. So in this case, if we have a shiny reflective metallic object like this, then with something to reflect, it will indeed give us reflection, but if all we have in the scene is a light and no environment to reflect, we still get these specular hits from the light itself, which of course we can see for certain if I rotate the light there a little bit. Obviously he's still reflecting himself, so we do still have traced reflections here. I can prove that by of course turning them off. We still get specular from the light. So that is one of the great things about material nodes, of course, is that they have this unified specular property. Obviously, of course, when we're setting up our materials a lot of the time, are we using lights, are we using image-based lighting and so on, we have to make these choices between specular or reflection and balance the two out and so on, if we have a mix, or perhaps render different passes. With the material nodes we don't have to, but we will still get different passes. We will get a reflection buffer and a specular buffer. The roughness setting is quite common. This is basically your reflection blur setting, and it doesn't ray trace unless you turn on the reflection blur here. But it does, of course, affect the specular, basically as if you turn the gloss down. The other thing that you should definitely remember when it comes to these specular and reflection values in materials, or at least in the energy conserving ones, is that they already have built-in accurate Fresnel functions for the kinds of material that they are, such as conductors and dielectrics. And so when feeding the specular inputs or setting values, you do not need, and in fact should not, give them Fresnel effects that you are making somehow else, nodally. Some materials will have something of this nature. You have the Oren-Naya switch here. This is basically just deciding which underlying shader to use. In the case of conductor here, you have the Oren-Naya shader available, or, with it off, the normal Lambertian shader. What you'll also see on some of these materials, again conductor and dielectric showing it here, but also delta and others, is that whilst they have a specular / reflection input, there's no diffuse input. There's colour, but no diffuse value. This is the other feature of material nodes, is that they are energy conserving materials. The shaders are set up so as the specular at a given spot goes up, the diffuse comes down. Or of course in the case of transparent materials, the transparency goes down. In the case of dielectric, we also have diffuse as well, because we have the colour, which is available from absorption, and so of course the absorption value is also thrown into the energy conservation mix. So we see there some very pretty looks indeed. You will also notice the interpolated options for reflection and refraction blurring. Again, good for stills, can speed up your renders, best avoided in animation, just like in the shaders. The last thing to be aware of with material shaders, and this comes down in a large part to their energy conserving behaviour, is you want to make sure that you are using the correct colour preset in order to get the best results. People do sometimes have trouble with materials, finding them a little harsh. It is usually because you are in the wrong colour space, namely the default, where everything is linear. This doesn't mean that Lightwave is linear. It means that Lightwave thinks you're already working in linear. Basically, what all of us are using here is sRGB. So it doesn't matter why, all of the explanations of linear workflow, set yourself to the sRGB preset. Ideally, all the time, but certainly for materials. So there we go, there's a little opening overview of our material nodes here in Lightwave's node editor, and some of the kind of standard behaviours and inputs that we'll see shared between them.